All right, we're back for the second part with Lance and Chris. Uh, I did that 20-minute video when they were Lance was kind of dissecting the beehives there. I managed to get out of it without any bee stings. Lance had his
Suit on.
little bee suit on, so he was fine. You got stung a few times there.
Yeah, I got one under the eye here, might swell up during the video, and then one up here. And I took one on the left ear.
That was after I shut the camera off. How many times have you said you've been stung everywhere?
Yeah, I've been stung pretty well everywhere. And they say that you could take 500 stings, the average man, not going into anaphylactics because you're allergic. But the histamine kind of sticks around. It's like a residual buildup of histamine. So eventually you might be saturated with this venom and have some complications with the ticker. I get a half a dozen stings on a regular tour out of the hives. But I have been lit up before.
What's lit up? Explain to me what lit up is.
I think we counted 50 on my back the one day, and it was a pretty hot hive. It was a good hive, strong hive, but often the trade-off with a really prolific worker bee that is going strong on the wing, doesn't matter if it's a rainy or windy day, they're going out to forage. The trade-off would be they may be aggressive, and we have dealt with that in the past. There was one hive, Schultz, you remember, you were ready to call the queen.
Yeah, man, A11. Yeah. The Daryl's yard, yeah. It was hard, man. I remember writing my notes, and the notes actually were written as I was being stung. And I noted the pain I was in at that moment, and it really reflected, when you have enough bees to cull a queen, that's a consideration that you have when, how much pain do you really want to take when you're out there.
Well, I noticed like you had your bee suit on, but you weren't even wearing gloves. So you were like right in there, like pulling out each slide or slat or whatever you call it. Frame. You didn't have any gloves on at all, and you didn't get stung at all out there.
Well, I got one on my hand. But
okay. And then you said you took a bunch off the face.
Yeah, so what we did there, the hive that got me, there was a queen excluder. We just transported the hives cross country. So we had a queen excluder on the bottom, queen excluder on the top. That would just ensure that overnight, when we built this colony yesterday for Dave, that the queen was there. It was a queen rate colony. In transport, the queen wouldn't be lost. What I got stung over was there's a very real possibility she was right on that queen excluder, and of course she will have all of her attendants around her being certain that she's fine, because without her
they have no colony.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. If they were to lose her, they would create one, but then it's a huge setback. So you want to sell a queen rate colony, of course. You can only sell a queen rate colony. It would be wrong to do anything else. And what happened there was I took the queen excluder off the bottom, and as soon as I dropped that queen excluder down, they kicked up. And I got one immediately under my right eye, and then one up here, and then they started coming around me a bit more, saying like, okay, we found a target, and I got one in the left ear.
Now, is it true that when you get stung by a honeybee, that they die after they sting you?
Yeah, so what happens is there's tiny little barbs on their stinger, and it actually rips that whole section of the bee off. And there'll be a little venom sac still attached to it, and you can watch it pulsate. It's still injecting yourself with the venom. So right away I'm trying to take this one out, and I was trying to take this one out, and I was trying to take this one out. And this is sort of what happens is you're trying to get this out. Now if you were to get stung on the hand, because like you noticed we weren't wearing gloves, and we haven't worn gloves in several years, and we find that we're far more gentle. We used to wear the leather gloves, and we'd go right in there very invasively, taking all the frames out,
down too,
just
after you handle
crushing bees, like no dexterity to what we were doing. So we got rid of the gloves, and then we got stung less elsewhere because they were comfortable with the way we were handling them.
Right.
Yeah.
That being said, when one stings you, if you're trying to save this bee, you can actually work that little stinger out and she can fly off without losing her life.
Right.
Even though she's stuck into you, you can free her. But the trouble there is you try to free her, and then 2 more are on your other knuckles.
Right.
So then you're trying to work these ones out, and
The
in the end, you're best just to get rid of that one and carry on.
Right.
If you are stung, you take a card and just kind of push it off, right? Like you don't want to grab the stinger, because when you grab it, you're actually forcing the venom into your bloodstream. So you actually just want to swish it off. That's the way to, if you are stung, to remove the stinger, to mitigate as much venom intake that you can do, just push it off. And when you have the hive tool, it's actually easier because you're working the hive with the hive tool. It's a small crowbar. You saw it in the previous video, but you just kind of push it off with the hive tool, and then there's not as much venom that's going into your bloodstream,
Right.
and then you can continue on.
Now, one question I wanted to ask you guys is, how did you guys even get into this? How did you get into bees and beekeeping?
So our good friend Justin Murray was having a house party on Motherwell, and we were kind of downstairs having some beers, talking about things. Lance was a student at University of Guelph and was interested obviously in botany, but the bees came in, and I read an article at work called Little Bees, Big Potential, and it was actually about the alfalfa leafcutter bee, not the honeybee at all. And we had a serious loss of native pollinators, and the crops being that it's 100 acres here of soy, 100 acres there of corn, next to another 100 acres of soy. There's this monoculture farming system that's going on, and there's a huge decrease in native pollinators. So the article was about a bee that was very efficient at pollinating, but I couldn't source any alfalfa leafcutter bees. Lance knew somebody with honeybees, so we bought a couple of colonies together.
And we've been talking about it ever since. It was, a discussion at a buddy's party, and there were some pictures exchanged and some interest shown, and we just never stopped talking about it. Really, is why.
That was a decade ago.
Yeah.
So 10 years ago, what did you start out? Like, how many, you decided, okay, we want to do this, we're interested in bees, so you went and purchased a couple colonies, or how did that all come into what you're doing now?
So that was part of the learning curve. Was bees aren't cheap. So Dave just ponied up $500 to us for 2 colonies. So that's what we're here doing today. And I couldn't believe a little box of insects would cost so much money. But we purchased 2 from John
Van Blyderbean,
Yep.
Oxford Honey and Supplies.
And that was our first taste in it.
Yeah.
We went out there. I got stung in the face, and that was my
I
first
remember that too.
first sting there. He said, "Well, now you've been stung, and if this is for you, and that doesn't bother you, then you're gonna do all right." And
So you were christened with the first bee sting, and you were on
didn't
board.
even own any yet. Yeah, I was in.
It's right in his head too.
And you've heard the term labor of love, and
Right.
absolutely, being an apiarist, like, it is a labor of love. It's probably the cheapest form of meditation that one could tap into. You open the colony, and they're so busy about their orderly. We've taken so much insight from them, and you just see how they work so well together. It's
So
a
they're
super-
focused on their purpose.
It's a super organism, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not one. It's a collective effort.
Right.
And every time I open a hive, it's been 10 years and I learned something. It's not you got all the answers right away, and you don't. Like, you could talk to Bill Ferguson that we mentioned in the first part of the series here, where he was actually president of the OBA. He's probably
Now, what's OBA?
the Ontario Beekeepers Association.
Okay.
So he was the president for a long time. He preserves the buckfast strain around here, and
Yeah, it's
He would learn
it's
still.
a recognized Ontario Producers Association. So the government, OMAFRA, is the regulator, and the OBA is where people come to exchange ideas and network, and
Okay.
you know.
So like a mastermind group.
Yep. Yep.
and master beekeepers,
Right.
including Mr. Bill Ferguson, which I had the privilege to sit in on a grafting day with him years and years and years ago. And that's what we'll be going to do when we leave this video, is to graft some of our own colonies.
Now, what does that mean? Grafting a colony, without trying to crystallize that down.
Basically, so yesterday we built a colony that is called a starter colony that will get these young developing queens up and going. So we're going to go to the best stock that we have. We're going to pluck a few cells, put this little larva into a cup that's going to develop into a fine queen. You're going to take that from the starter colony to a finished colony, and they're going to be like these little peanut-shaped queen cells. And then from there, you're going to start your nukes.
Yeah, that's
your new colonies.
That starter colony takes care of that queen cup, develops it into a queen, feeds it royal jelly, gives it all the attention it needs, and as it grows, it has the potential to become a queen. And that finisher colony will cap it, will make sure that it's been fed all its nutrition, everything it needs to be a viable queen, robust. And then when we take that frame from that finisher colony, there might be several queens on that frame, and we can give a queen to each hive.
Okay.
So we can make several different nukes or hives or colonies with that queen. We can requeen if our queens are maybe older. They live about 5 years. A newer queen is more robust. Has more vitality. And some queens die mid-season. Maybe they've contracted some virus, or a varroa mite has latched onto them and leached out their life force, and they've died, and there's no queen. So there's a need to requeen. And if you're building more colonies from your original stock, we have 15, like Chris said. We want to get a bit more now, so we want to divide those out, but each colony needs a queen. And like I said, there's 2 weeks for a queen development. By the time the egg is laid and it's capped and goes on its mating flight, to then be actually a laying queen and to be a viable laying queen, it takes about 2 weeks. So right now, if we graft, we're producing a large number of queens all at once. So we can then make new colonies or requeen existing colonies to make sure that those queens are healthy and viable and vital, and they can then continue on to the next season.
Okay, so if you had an established colony, and as an experiment, you were to take that queen and remove the queen out of that colony, what would happen to that colony after the queen is removed?
They would produce a queenless roar. The whole colony would know that there are now no more pheromones left from their original queen. And that would trigger a response where they would start grooming cells to become their next queen. And
Okay.
they would start feeding it royal jelly, which is just a high protein diet. So from an anatomy standpoint, this worker bee is exactly the same at the very early stages, hours old. But eventually, with this high protein diet, she'll elongate and she'll be able to develop into a fully functioning queen. Now, if you were to do a hard split like that, where you just remove the queen with no grafting, no planning into that, she might be developed on a cell halfway up a frame. And it would be an emergency cell that they would create a queen from an existing egg. But what you'll find naturally on a Langstroth hive is connected to the bottom of that frame would be an intentional queen cell to swarm. And what happens there is that queen develops so efficiently. They're packing that royal jelly from the very beginning. They know that this is going to be a new queen. That old queen then would leave that hive with a good percentage of those worker bees and establish herself somewhere else, leaving behind these queen cells. Now what happens there is you would have more than just that one queen cell. That first queen to emerge is going to go around and inject a sting into the other peanuts, these queen cells that have been built, and kill those queens. You'll have supersedure swarms, like you might have 2 or 3 swarms from one colony. Those queens might emerge at the same time, and you might have an additional swarm go out because they know that they're honey bound, there's no more room for this queen to lay, they're going to go off and establish yet again. But often what will happen is that first queen will come out, destroy the other cells, or hatch at the same time, duke it out, and there'll be one queen. So then that queen's going to fly out, become mated, and be a laying queen.
So if you have a hive and multiple potential queens hatch out, the most dominant one is the one that ultimately becomes the queen bee?
You hope.
Mm-hmm.
You hope.
Okay.
You hope it's not a Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson bout where the wrong guy wins. You're hoping that that's your most advanced genetically queen to carry on that colony.
Right.
And you know what? We actually have seen a colony with multiple queens. We've opened a lid, an outer cover, and found 2 queens in the same colony before. And it's my opinion. You'd have to read up on other beekeepers that have documented their observations, but it's my opinion that if a queen is laying a supersedure cell for a new queen, for a swarm cell, like Chris talked about on the bottom, it's not an emergency cell, but it's a planned supersedure. It's like a new government taking over, or a new queen becoming the chief of the hive. That is preordained. The current queen, I think, understands that there's a need to supersede. There's a need to spread its genetics, to leave that home, to find a new home, and they want to make sure that the queen that is there has all its resources that it needs. And we like Chris said, there's definitely a hierarchy to the queen who is in that hive. If there are multiple queen cells, they will duke it out, they will battle out. But I have also seen multiple queens in the same hive, and I believe that those queens are planning a successor, as it were, where they're ready to swarm, but they want to make sure that that queen has enough resources to continue on.
Is it possible that the 2 queens at their menses synchronized and they just became besties?
Yeah, and then what stock is loyal to which queen? I mean, is it one box to the next box? Is there enough of a separation? We run queen excluders now, but we always...
All right, you guys, this is way more technical, way more complex. I was not expecting it. I don't even know what the fuck these guys are even talking about. It's like Dave when he gets on his pod. I don't even know what the fuck you're talking about. Let's get to some simple questions. How do bees actually make honey? How does that whole process work? And kind of crystallize that down.
So bees will bring in 2 sources of feed. One is nectar from a flower, and the other is pollen, also from a flower. So they're getting flower. So when I say flower, I don't mean exclusively wildflowers growing in your bush or your ditch or your garden or wherever. I mean any kind of plant that has a flower, which is every plant. So it could be a tree, it could be a flower, it could be a perennial, an annual, whatever. But they're taking nectar and they're taking pollen.
Okay.
And for honey, nectar is the precursor. So with nectar, the bees will actually suck it up through their tongue. It's if I was a human bee, my tongue would stretch out on this table, and they could suck up all this nectar and fill their guts with it.
Right.
And then they fly back to the hive. They regurgitate everything they've just ingested from the flower, and they pass it off to another worker bee. So all these workers are on the frames on each cell, and they're right there. They're actually ventilating that cell, evaporating all the moisture out from the nectar, which has a high moisture, to the honey, which is low moisture, 18% Brix about, which actually removes all bacteria from that cell. Bacteria can't grow with that water activity. The honey is actually very sterile because bacteria, even though sugar is a very good source of food, there's not enough moisture for the bacteria to grow. So the bees actually outcompete the bacteria by reducing the water activity to the point where the nectar now with high water activity is now evaporated to honey with low water activity. And really that's a worker's life is spent doing that work on evaporating the nectar and making it into honey. They actually start with the nurse bees after they emerge from their cells. They give their attention to other brood that are emerging. You know, it's kind of like, hey, I just emerged, and I'm going to help you emerge. And then as they the next cycle of brood emerges, then they start to work on the honey, and then at after they've experienced that part of their life, they actually go out to forage. Then they're actually in the flowers, bringing in that nectar into their guts, and then bringing it back to the other workers to
So basically,
evaporate.
it's processed bee vomit.
Yep. 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 Yeah, and their enzymes really are phenomenal. I mean, the honeybee is well adapted to creating a sterile honey,
Right.
you know, because of their vomit. It's all in their genetic code. They make those proteins inside of them.
Right. So say okay. Right now we're at the tail end of May. So from the time spring starts, flowers start to bloom, how long from the time the bees can safely leave their colony to start foraging again, how long of a process before you can start to harvest honey out of that hive?
So we've been targeting September to harvest all of the colonies, like take all of the honey off, put it into the honey house, so that they have plenty of time between September and October to pack things as they like it to overwinter. And we leave more. They say 80 pounds is sort of safe where we are in our northern climate. We leave closer to 100 pounds of honey on every colony. We're not interested in cropping honey. We're interested more so in the bees themselves. So we crop enough. I mean, I sell enough honey to friends and family to last harvest to harvest. So we leave them with more than enough honey. Like Schultz said, it's all capped, preserved. This honey, once it's capped, will last thousands of years without fermenting. It's at that perfect moisture content. They've sealed it in wax. So from, like Sheldon was asking, say May to September, they've built all that honey up through the season. We've taken what we want, left them with enough to get through the winter, and then they're going to pack it. They've got plenty of time to organize the hive as they were going to get through the winter. And they will only move up. They'll move over, left or right, but say they moved up too quick, they might leave 3 or 4 frames in the bottom that are full of honey yet, but they won't move back down in the dead of winter. They're only going to move up. They're going to consume that honey, and that's why we make sure we overwinter with 2 boxes. We've heard people have success overwintering nukes, overwintering one single deep colony. We've never had success with that. We just leave them with lots, and then we can rule out starvation as a problem with that failing colony,
root cause.
Yeah, because like bees are worth more than honey.
So how do you actually harvest the honey out of a hive?
We built a honey house at Lance's cousin's there. He was
Daryl
generous.
Herb,
Yeah, Daryl Herb, very generous
beautiful
man.
man.
He's helped us
Love
out
him
in a
for
big
sure.
way. There's no way we could have done what we're doing now without that. We were processing honey in my kitchen, my backyard.
Okay.
So
How do you actually get the honey from the hive into a jar?
So what we do is we pull it into this honey house that we've built. It's
So,
nice.
what we're pulling in is actually the frames of capped honey. So like I
Okay.
mentioned before, there the nectar is evaporated. It eventually becomes honey. The bee enzyme converts that nectar into the honey. It removes the moisture. It creates a conformation with the sugars and everything. They pack it into these cells, and then they fill it with a wax coating, and that wax coating preserves it.
Right.
It's at the exact right moisture, like Chris was saying, and so that's what we're bringing into the honey house. And so then we remove it. We remove the wax coating with a knife, a hot knife. You can also use a scraper tool mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
We find the hot knife is especially helpful when there's a little bit of overlap from the frame. So if they've built out the frame a little bit further from the edge, then you can just kind of cleave it with that knife, and then that wax falls off, and then underneath is all liquid honey.
Okay, so
it's in an uncapping tank now at this point in the story.
Okay, hold on. Just let me. I'm trying to. So all these little, when we showed on the first video, when Lance was pulling out the what'd you call them?
Frames.
The frames.
Yeah.
All the comb, those little holes. So that's where
Right.
the honey's inside
That's where
each
the
of
honey
those
is.
little. So
Yep.
they cap that off with wax to preserve it.
Right?
Correct.
So basically, they're like little tiny jars of honey inside
Yeah,
the hive.
Right.
So you're basically with a knife removing all the lids
Yes.
off of these little tiny jars of honey in the hive.
Yes.
Now, how do you extract or remove the honey from those little tiny hundreds or thousands of little jars in the honeycomb? Extract that out.
All right. So long answer. Where we're at in the process is, like Lance said, we take those frames out. They got to be 80% capped. That's safe. You know that at least at that point the moisture content's been whacked down enough when you're uncapping those that the rest will be safe to harvest also. So then you take that frame with the hot knife, you scrape off that wax.
Right.
That wax drops into the base of uncapping tank. It drips off the honey that's stuck to it. Then you take those frames that you've now taken those wax cappings off,
Right.
put it into a centrifuge. We have 2 of them. So
Okay.
we fill those up. It spins it around. It slings the honey to the side walls. Then it cools down. It goes into a 5-gallon bottling bucket. From there, put it into a warming tank where we don't let it get over 35 degrees.
all
but
the
it's
wax
just more viscous.
settles to the top, and all the honey is
Goes to the
underneath.
bottom.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we filter it through, and that's all we do. We don't pasteurize. We just keep it basically as the bees packed it. We just take the crud out. Now, what also needs to be mentioned is we put queen excluders on. So when it comes to harvest, we don't have larvae, eggs, brood mixed within the honey that we're harvesting.
Right.
Right. So we
We
will
can
have
just take
colonies
those-
out there without
frames
queen
off.
excluders. We'll
pack
allow
them
to
in.
go rogue and build 3, 4 high if they want, but those are just to be split into other colonies. Those are not production colonies. That's
Right.
simply breeding stock.
Now with the the wax. Now I know I can't think offhand, but I have heard something to do with beeswax, that byproduct is useful in other areas. Now, do you harvest and take that byproduct and then sell that for other purposes, or you just garbage the beeswax?
So we have a solar wax melter out at the one hive, a yard, and we take the wax cappings that we burricomb, whatever that we're out there breaking apart, and we'll throw it into that. It hasn't worked 100%, but we do have a collection of solar melted wax.
And every year we do harvest quite a bit of wax, and
Wax capping.
even just from the honey harvest, like when we're extracting that lid from those jars of honey in the frames,
Yeah.
all that wax, we can't do anything with it. We have to separate it from the honey, so we collect it and then we let it drip from all its honey and collect the honey and run it through that process Chris described. And then we actually melt that wax down, and when we melt it down, we're removing any bee parts or any
Right.
crud.
Slum gum.
Yeah, slum gum. Yeah, and then we actually get a wax product that can be used as candles, or
Right.
can you can put on a cutting board, or it can seal things, and and honestly, when we're out there, like the bird comb Chris talked about, the honeybees actually emit wax from glands under their wings. So when they're working and they're doing their thing, part of their whole life cycle is to emit the wax, kind of like breathing for us.
Right.
But they breathe out wax from these glands, and they make these. They draw comb or make burr comb, or from a bare foundation, they actually will build out the wax so you can pack the honey in it. They make the jars,
Right.
so to speak, out of wax,
Okay.
and that can be melted down. And we do melt it down, and there's a lot of good uses for it. There's some negative ions that when you light a candle, that wax combustion actually fuses with ions in the air and removes particles in the air and brings them to the floor, so it actually cleanses your breathing space and where you're living.
That's interesting.
My wife processes most of our wax, and she'll make lip balms and bricks of beeswax to sell, like to a woodworker or
Right.
violin makers.
So you
had
guys
tattooers buy it.
So you guys are actually using that wax and then
Yeah.
processing it down and,
Yeah.
and using it for yourself or selling it for other.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Even,
so there's
the,
no
even
waste.
the byproduct of the byproduct, if you were to call the wax a byproduct, slum gum, you can use for fire starters. So you just dip a pine cone into it, and it'll get hot. Like beeswax burns hot. So the monks that used to heat their temples would use a wall full of beeswax candles.
Oh, very interesting.
It burns hot.
Yeah, this is way more in depth than what I was. I had no idea. I just thought bees make honey, and we put honey on our toast or in our coffee or our tea or whatever. Okay, so you brought 2 hives to Dave today.
Yep.
So come harvest time, how much honey could he potentially harvest out of those just 2 hives?
So there's an old saying, it's May. They say a hive in May is worth a load of hay. A hive in June is worth a silver spoon, and a hive in July ain't worth a fly. And this will be true for Dave. So what he has out there right now is at least 3 frames in each colony packed full of emerging brood. So those colonies, they're not
With the
nukes.
laying queen.
That's a laying queen. Those are single deeps. They're full of bees and already need room to expand. So we put a second box on them now.
Yeah, because on the first video, when Lance pulled those hives open, like you could clearly see in the video that there was an astronomical amount of bees in those hives.
Thousands.
Working away. Most of those bees weren't even concerned that the fact that we were basically ripping the roof off of their house. They were so focused on their purpose, on doing whatever it is that that these guys are doing, which these guys tried to explain, which I don't fucking get any of it. It's super fascinating, but they were so focused on what it is that they were doing. So anyway, yeah.
So these colonies, to answer your question, are going to explode in the next 2 to 3 weeks. There's some bush around here that does have American linden basswood trees, which have a bloom in June. They will absolutely be at full capacity with foragers ready to go and harvest all of that flow. So the nectar that comes off the basswood tree, I can't remember the number, but I want to say it's like 200 pounds a tree or something. It's outrageous. Like if there was a 10-pack of trees in the bush right next door, they're going to pull in a harvest just off of that.
And those trees only bloom once every few years. I think it's
Seven years is the
Yeah.
magic year.
Yeah, so like if you're thinking about making bees or putting out colonies, you really need to think about where they're being located and
Where
what
they're
kind
going to
of
harvest from or forage
That's right.
from.
That's right. Yeah.
So
Yep.
June bloom, like the reason the basswood is a huge nectar producer, period, but the fact that it blooms later than the rest of the native flora around here is a huge advantage to Dave, because this colony here, these two colonies will explode just in time for the majority of the foragers to go out and pull that in. And they'll do a little waggle dance. They're going to go around and they're going to say, hey, there's some excitement going over here. You know, we got to go northeast. Let's check this bush out. And they will, and then they'll come back. And so his hope is that his nice little flower patch out here is going to get pollinated. But what bees are is opportunists. So like Sheldon said, they weren't busying themselves around us out there. They've got an agenda. They know that it's a finite amount of time to get out and forage. So they're looking already in their new environment, where's the food?
Right.
And they're going to come in and they're going to do the little figure 8 patterns and they're going to wiggle. And the more excited they are, that means that's a stronger signal to the rest of the colony. Come follow me this way. We got to go this way. There's a flow. And they're going to go and they're going to hit it, and they're opportunists. So he might have this little 1/4 acre flower garden going, but if there's a 100 acre canola field across the road, well, they're all going to fly to those yellow flowers. Simple as that.
Mhm.
Now, how far will these bees travel from their hive to forage?
I've heard 5 mile. I don't know that that's true.
Yeah. 5 mile. That's on the periphery. I mean, 6 kilometers for sure.
It would have to be a very, very lucrative flow
Yeah.
for them to travel that far.
Right.
Because
So,
think of all of the encounters along that way, right?
so with you guys being the professionals and setting up these hives today, and knowing the country here, is this location here a prime location for them to forage?
Certainly it is. You've got the Bayfield River over there where there's going to be all kinds of native flora in there. They're going to go in there, they're going to find some trefoil, they're going to find some clover crops that have been left over. There's going to be organic dairy operations going on around here. They're going to hit the alfalfa. The other big bonus is the dandelions, and these organic guys are just in full bloom right now.
Right.
All our bees are hitting fields of organic operations where there is wildflower, an abundance. But the trefoil is a good one too, and it, you know, was it 2 years ago we had some really unfavorable weather for the farmers, but it was really favorable for us. They couldn't get out into the
Yeah.
fields, so we had
It was,
like
yeah, 2
fully
years ago.
mature flowers out there before.
On the
Ideally,
alfalfa
they're going to want to
fields.
keep the protein in check, and they're going to go out
Purple
and
buds.
harvest earlier.
Yeah.
But they weren't able to get out in the fields, so we had a bumper crop that
Yeah.
year just because of that.
Now, is there, okay, because you said like these bees are foraging from all kinds of different plants, trees, so on and so forth. If you were to, hypothetically, I don't even know if this is possible, but if you were to take a hive of bees and strictly limit them to a specific type of pollen, like, okay, so say you like, I think it was basswood.
Yeah.
So if you had a big population of basswood trees where the bees were strictly, for the most part, harvesting or bringing back their pollen specifically, mostly from a specific type of plant versus a variety of plants or a different source, would that change possibly the flavor of the honey?
100%.
Oh, definitely.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are operations that are more in line with producing honey that capture those flows.
Right.
So they would deliberately take off honey supers that have been collected from other floral sources, and then just say, okay, we want to strictly capture the flow of buckwheat, which is a very dark honey, and there'd be a buckwheat field about to bloom, and they would move these all out there, and they would collect this buckwheat honey, and then market it as a custom batch of buckwheat honey.
Introduce yourself, you're in the pick.
Just your regular Jeej, your neighborhood friend.
All right.
So Greg there, he's helped us out over the years too. He's done a lot of the woodworking. He's been out to the hives quite a few times. He's had his handful of stings, and
electrical
grateful to have an
setups.
extra set of hands.
For sure.
I mean, it's a big work.
I just want to know, where's the beers?
They're right in that fridge, or you can go into my trunk.
So yeah, to answer your question, absolutely, they do selective harvesting on certain
Okay.
flora. That's,
She's empty.
but we've never done that.
Right.
So our honey, it's a mixed bag of nuts. You get a jar from case 44, it will look different from a jar out of case 12. We do custom batches in the sense that we've only got 2 small extractors, and we, take 10 frames, put them into this, 10 frames, put them into that, mix it up. So you'll see the difference between the location of the yards, and some will be very light honey,
Right.
and then the goldenrod is very dark. So if it was near the end of the harvest and there's a big flow of goldenrod, we might be bringing that in. We try not to leave much goldenrod flow into the colonies, but it's difficult when we harvest early because that's one of the last things they're out there foraging on. It crystallizes way faster than clover, say.
Okay.
Way faster. So now you've got this honey that's been packed in and it's crystallizing, which makes it harder on the digestive system
Right.
of that overwintering colony.
So, how many? So the 2 colonies you set up today. How many pounds of honey do you think potentially could be harvested out of that this year?
Hive in May is worth a load of hay. He might get 80 pounds surplus honey off of each colony, so 160 pounds.
Okay, explain surplus.
This would be,
This part I actually know what you're talking about,
yeah.
but for the viewers, what's the case? 60 pounds of honey harvested, 160 pounds in total. Explain that. I know what you mean. But
So we're gonna leave them with 80 to 100 pounds minimum to overwinter with. They're gonna build boxes above that queen excluder that are just full of clean, clear honey.
right.
We might harvest that honey, or Dave might say, 2 was great, but I want 4. So maybe he does some mid-season splits and he needs to start spreading that honey
Right.
around, and he doesn't harvest anything at all.
So Dave could potentially, those bees could produce 160 pounds of honey.
They could produce more.
But for the wind, okay, now here's what
Okay.
so here's actually a legitimate question for myself. So 160 pounds of honey. Now, after you harvest that and you spin it out in your centrifuge, that harvested honey, do you take that and then pour that into the hive, or do you leave so much
Frames.
of unharvested honey in the hive?
Unharvested honey.
Right.
Okay, so you'll leave X amount of frames that are capped off, and you just leave those and don't harvest that.
That's right. And
Okay.
also, the frames that we have spun, we take back out to the yard to let them rob it out.
Okay.
So then we'll have, hundreds of boxes stacked up of spun out frames, and they will go to town. They can clean up these boxes overnight. Like, it's incredible how much they will remove from those. They will be
Okay.
bone dry and weightless, but you'll put the boxes out and they'll still have some heft to them because you can't sling it all out, especially
Right.
if it did have some crystallized in it already. So we'll take that back out. They're going to clean it out. Now it's a 2-part system there. 1, they're going to bolster up the amount of food that got over winter, but 2, they're going to take away all of that honey that is going to attract wax moth,
Right.
and that is a beekeeper's nightmare because you're not out there attentive to the wax moth when your frames are in storage. We're out there all the time, and a strong colony is going to deal with wax moth inside of it. It won't have a chance.
Now, is that like a parasite or something?
It's a moth. It comes in, it
Okay.
eats off the casings and all the stuff that the bees drop.
Right. So it's
off the frame.
basically like weeds, aggressive weeds to a cash crop.
Yeah.
farmer.
But they ruin your frames.
Okay.
It makes
Or
this
mold even
cocoon
too, yeah.
mess of webbing, and like imagine a spider web on steroids. Like, you can hardly even pull the frames apart.
Okay.
They're done. And they also will tunnel through wood. So you'll have all these, almost like the emerald ash borer pattern. You'll have this pattern on your
Right.
woodware of these developing larvae that
Right.
chew through this wood. So you need the bees to clean up your frames. You need to store them in a safe place, and this is what we do, and that's what we
And
harvest.
the wax moth are not good in cold. So it's good to actually freeze your frames or keep your frames out over the winter in some sort of a hut where the air temperature is cold enough to be below zero, but
Okay.
the frames aren't actually exposed to the cold or to the moisture of snow or ice or sleet, where it's actually being ventilated.
So when you pull these frames out for harvest, do you put empty ones back in? Like, how does that work? Because I seen when you tore that frame, there
Yeah.
were so many frames in that hive.
Right.
So you pull out X amount of frames to harvest the honey out of. Then there's a big empty space in there. So when this harvest is happening, are you putting empty frames back in to
No.
take up that space,
No.
or is it just a big open box?
Yeah, so as Chris said before, so the bees move up, and they make honey above the queen excluder. So what we run is two brood chambers. So there's a box and then a second box, and then on that second box we run a queen excluder, and all the boxes above it are pure honey, because the queen can't actually go up there and lay eggs or make brood.
Right.
So all of that, they're drawing out the comb, packing it with honey, filling it with wax, and sealing it.
So you're saying is when you're harvesting, you then stack hives on top of each other?
No.
Yeah, we stack boxes.
We're taking the boxes from. We had the twin towers. I think we had 6, maybe even 7 on the one hive. So you got your brood chamber, your first 2 boxes,
double
the
each.
queen excluder. Then we had 3, 4, sometimes even 5 boxes on top of those,
Right.
full of honey.
Right.
Right. So then we take those down and we're whacking those boxes down to 2 single deep colonies
Right.
where we've got.
For the winter.
They're home. They're
Okay.
home. They're home. This is it. This is the way they need to pack their home to get themselves through the winter. And we've had so many bees before in those twin tower hives that we dismantled down to 2. There were so many bees you couldn't even put the lid on. The lid was like you had a pile of worms underneath it, just wiggling down. And there's so many, they're bearding out of the front because you've just taken all of those.
Yeah, you're
Bees.
basically condensing
Right.
their home from 7 frames or 7
Boxes.
boxes down to 2.
That's
Right.
right.
Okay.
And that's one of the considerations that you take when you're thinking about breeding, right? You want a strong build up in spring, but you also don't want a queen that's building a lot of bees in the fall, because in the fall you really want the numbers down.
You want them to dwindle earlier.
Okay.
Right.
Now this just came to me now. So when you're condensing, say, 6 boxes of bees down to 2, my logic says that would almost be essential to get through the winter, because you're condensing that many bees into a tighter area, which would actually help possibly survival. They're packed in tighter, creates more heat.
Yeah.
I don't know. This
You
maybe I'm
want-
completely
want-
out to lunch.
Yeah, you want a healthy size cluster. There's no doubt about it. Now, the Italian bee is known for a buildup later in the season, which isn't favorable. Like, you actually
Yeah,
don't
that's
want
fine.
too big of a cluster.
Right.
They're going to consume more resources. They will be warmer
We'll eat
longer,
more honey. Yeah.
but they're going to eat more honey, and then you could have an issue there. The buckfast bees here, they're good at quick spring buildup, but then they dwindle. Say in August, they slow down their production.
Right.
And the queen will actually lay a brood pattern all year, even in the winter, but it
Even in
might
the
just be
winter.
the size of a toonie, right? So now you've got this cluster around these eggs that are developing, but it's just this tiny little pattern that she's laying. She's really slowed right down, and then they'll move like the penguins huddled around these eggs. They won't even go eat. They'll starve to death if you don't have honey readily available next to them, because they will not leave that developing larva.
Okay. Now I think we talked about this off camera when you were dissecting the hive, but I thought it was super interesting. One queen bee, how many eggs and how often she lays her eggs?
Well, I've heard reports about a queen laying up to 2,000 eggs in a day.
A day. Now, is this every day?
Not necessarily. I mean, 2,000 eggs every day is, maybe the best queen you've ever had.
Okay, so an average queen, how many eggs, how often?
It all depends on the amount of space that she has to lay. So when you're dissecting those frames, you're looking at the brood pattern. So is there are there eggs in there, or are there larvae, are there capped brood, and is the capped brood, fully uniform on that
Now,
hive?
brood, those are like baby bees waiting to emerge.
That's right. That's right. Right. And we showed that in the video too,
Yes.
the difference between the worker brood and the drone brood. And when they're capped, they're further advanced in their life stage. They're emerging, so they're close to being actually fully formed worker bees. And when you're evaluating a queen, you want to see a nice uniform brood pattern on that frame. The more frames that are fully developed and uniform, the better she'll be.
Right.
And when they're hatching out, the workers will have to kind of polish the frame on the inside. They kind of clean it up, make sure there's no residue or
So basically,
piece of wax.
once a bee hatches out, they clean it out so the queen can go back in and lay eggs in there again.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. And a sign of a good queen is where you've seen the worker brood emerge. Maybe there are some other capped brood still to emerge, but she's already started laying in those empty empty cells.
Okay. So she basically lays eggs on demand.
Right. It all depends on how much room she has. And
Okay.
and as Chris said earlier, we use those queen excluders more so for ease of honey harvest. It's not to. It does in some way limit the queen's ability to lay, because she only has 2 boxes to lay in. But for our harvesting, it's much easier to do that. And we've also found too that if you give them 2 boxes to lay, the queen can lay in 2 boxes. That gives us enough bees to have enough nurse bees to tend for the brood, and enough foragers to actually forage for the nectar and the pollen and bring it
Right.
in and make honey.
Now, one other topic I wanted to discuss was there with pesticide use on fields and stuff, and there's been a lot of, I've heard, bee populations are dropping because of pesticides. How are your own personal collies? Talk a little bit about your possible growth or decline based upon chemical use in agriculture.
So I'm not certain that the neonicotinoid, if I'm pronouncing that right, pesticide group is all to blame. I think that there is some trouble with the half-life of this poison that lives into the creek beds, into the invertebrates that are developing off it. It doesn't go away tomorrow, so we need to be responsible with the use of this stuff. We've been sprayed. We've had a wand on the back of a trailer.
Yeah, literally
right,
on our backs.
right onto us. Yeah, and then we did lose colonies right there. So I can't say that it isn't a huge impact. What I'm more fearful of is this monoculture farming that's going on in all of Americas, where you've got 10,000 acres of almonds in California, and you got to truck in 70% of the bee population in the United States of America to pollinate this crop, and then it's a food desert all but those 3 weeks of the year. This is a problem. This is a bigger problem. And actually those inputs are probably because that problem exists. I think if we got back to our roots and started cropping diverse fields, if every man was responsible for 10 acres and took care of it and had a bit of a mixed bag of nuts, not just all the same thing for as far as the eye can see,
Right.
we would be much further ahead than just outlawing pesticides altogether.
And as Chris says, that almond pollination program, all of those bees are in the same place. So you can bring them from all over the country, all over the continent, to pollinate that crop. But all those bees are interacting. That flower is their epicenter. So you might have a bee from one hive, a bee from another hive. They're all congregating around these same flowers, these same nectar or pollen sources, and they interact with each other. They have hairs all over their body that bring in pollen or bring in nectar, and those hairs also will bring home viruses or bring home parasites with them.
Okay.
So all of those bees being brought to that same place, you're actually bringing all of the native pathogens from their own area, whether it's from Ohio or Ontario or
Okay.
Florida, wherever,
Yeah,
all congregating in the same area, sharing each other's viruses, and in a way, it's survival of the fittest. You need to, be able to adapt, but in a way, some of these colonies are going to die because they've been exposed to things that they've never experienced before.
right. They don't have an immune system for it.
Right, and that's the same idea about these pesticides, where they're really a novel compound that bees over their evolutionary history, Apis mellifera, European honeybee, have never been exposed to these compounds before. They're man-made. They're in a lab. They're injected into a seed, constitutively expressed into the entire plant cell repertoire. Any kind of cell that the plant has, whether it's the flower or the stalk or the stamen, whatever, it all has these chemicals expressed, and the bees are exposed to them. They're ingesting them, or they're taking them in with the nectar, with the pollen, as they're harvesting from those plants.
And then bringing all that back to the
hive.
Right.
Right. And there are, I have read some journals of, peer-reviewed articles where bees have a reduced ability to remember where their hive is, and that's an important thing when you're a forager.
So it's like
you
they're
go
drunk,
out.
basically.
It's a neurotoxin. So
Yeah.
it's the same idea as dementia, right? Like this neurotoxin, which would keep the pests from knowing where to go and losing orientation and ending up someplace else to die. This is the exact same thing that's happening to the honeybees, which is the exact same thing that's happening to the human race. So we've been taking these little spoonfuls of neurotoxins our entire life. Like, we're not eating out of grandma's garden anymore. We're
No.
eating all of this shit. Excuse my language, but we're eating this garbage, which in little mini doses is building up, and we're gonna have dementia in our 50s and our 60s, where normally maybe it happened in the 80s to 90s. But
Yeah.
this is a real threat, and
And
we're seeing it. This is the canary in the coal mine.
And I'm going to show you a picture of one hive that we found that just a week before this picture was shot was a viable colony. We checked it. There were brood. There were workers on that brood, attending to the brood. It was a laying queen, vibrant, healthy. And this is what I found. That entire pile are dead bees. They're dead bees. For what? I don't know. Changing the wind. I don't know. Maybe I don't know why they're all dead, but the queen plays a huge role in why a hive survives. Maybe the queen died and the brood didn't know what to do or something, but all of them, as you can see in that pile, died within a very small amount of time. They all died at the same time, and immediately they fall off the frame and in a huge pile, and they were dead. So to me, I mean, I'm not out there every day witnessing what's happening with that in that field or around that brood, but it was an acute response to something that happened in their environment, and they
it's
died
pretty
immediately.
drastic.
This
Yeah.
is where we got sprayed with the
Right.
wand. on
Yeah,
the
that
back
was
of
the
tractor.
same
Some
yard.
12-year-old farmer's boy, which he's just doing his thing. I mean,
Yeah.
conventional farming, I'm not knocking these guys. Like, they're putting a lot of food on a lot of tables, and they're
True.
just running with the system
Farmers
that
feed
works
cities, after all,
right
man.
now.
All
But
the farmers.
maybe we need to step back and appreciate a hard day's work and make these farms a little more diverse. And if there's some sort of a limit as to the minimum number of crops that you have per 100 acres, then so be it. But I think that this is the fundamental problem. There's a gentleman named Rudolf Stein who wrote The Commercial Beekeeper Will Be the Demise of This Breed of Insect. And I think that what he was getting at is that we're breeding them for certain traits only, and we're looking for more honey production. We're looking for bigger colonies, but maybe we're ignoring these genetics that need to be around still, although they're not the most prolific on the wing, but maybe they have some sort of natural resistance. We can't breed
Mhm.
out this detail. We need to keep these original stocks in check, and that's what Lance and I have been doing for 10 years. We haven't been selective breeding, just saying like, you know, we're only simply taking from this and we're going to breed it with this cousin because we think that this is going to be the best genetic makeup. No, we're taking Brother Adam's advice and we're going from this strain to that strain to that strain to breed the perfect honeybee. And I think that if we did this in all of agriculture, we'd be so much further ahead. Monoculture farming, in my mind, is a much bigger fear than pesticide use.
There's a lot of wisdom in hybrid vigor, and when you cross one strain from another, you're going to get the most potential in that first generation, that S1 or sibling 1 generation, where you get, you know, the best from both parents in that sense, and you know, it kind of dwindles out after your S1, S2, S3, S4, etc. You don't see the same kind of results. So it's important that at a breeder level, you're really paying attention to what traits you're crossing and what results you're getting in your S1 to actually propagate a strain that is suitable for your area. And as Chris mentioned a few times, Brother Adam, he did that across the world. And he did it out of a response to a blight of the bees in England. And actually the Buckfast strain, as we know it today, was bred out of the English bee, which actually isn't even around anymore because
Brown
of the brown bee, yes, because of pathogens that was exposed to
Is
in
it
its time.
Acrian?
Yeah. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but yeah, there was a bacterial pathogen that really decimated those British bee populations, and Brother Adam was mindful and wanted to preserve the British bees' lineage and created a Buckfast line that was eventually resistant to that Acrian, you know, however you pronounce it, but he brought in genetics from Syria, from, you know, northern Europe,
Amazon.
from all over the world, to really find some sort of a match that could resist that blight.
Now, we're gonna finish this off with one more question. What can we do, and my listeners and everybody else do? What's their part to help with a healthy bee population, whether it be planting wildflowers or whatever? What's something that each and every one of us can do?
Keep those dandelions. Don't worry about that manicured lawn.
Right on.
Don't subscribe to this office job where everything's just perfect and you're shoved into this little box. Enjoy nature as it's intended. Have those flowers grow rogue. Don't worry about the bishop's weed and the dandelions and all of this stuff, because it just wants to thrive also. You don't need to have this manicured lawn with your sprinkler system going. Grow something that doesn't need your sprinkler input. Have something there available for the bees. Just live more humble. Don't worry so much about what the next man thinks. Hey, do I look great today? You look great every day. Don't worry about this. Worry about what is going to do well in the environment that it's intended to live in, and try to stop making these inputs to change and manipulate the landscape. Now, I mean, this is a loaded thing to say because this honeybee that I love so much isn't native to here. The natives knew when white man got close, they would see a honeybee buzz around their camp. And they would know that John Smith was around the corner because it was the Europeans that came here that brought the honeybee. But don't kid yourselves, this is the canary in the coal mine. This bee is going to lay it out for the native pollinators, because only us commercial beekeepers are monitoring the levels of how many honeybees are making it year in, year out. And we were decimated. 2017 winter was a crippling year for us. But nobody's keeping track of the butterflies. There's nobody out there making notes on exactly how many little tiny mason bees are going in and out of the log pile. We're only here as commercial beekeepers monitoring the levels of these pollinators. There's native pollinators that have been completely decimated, hummingbirds and bats included. There's things that are going down in numbers significantly that aren't being recorded. So the honeybee is absolutely the canary in the coal mine, and don't worry about your totally green lawn. Let those dandelions pop.
That's right. And any flower that's emerging, that's displaying its nectar, its pollen, its petals, anything that is a mature flower. It's ready to be pollinated. Some of them are self-fertilizing. A lot of them are cross-fertilizing, cross-pollinating. You need the wind. You need pollinators like honeybees, like native bees, like mosquito flies or hummingbirds. These are all integral to the ecosystem. And when you have diversity in your ecosystem, you're going to have longevity. And when you're able to not just tell yourself, oh, you know, I need to have a perfectly green lawn, you know, it's uniform. But when you look at a flower, realize that is a food source for all these other insects around it. And even if you don't see them, even if they're not honeybees, there are insects in your garden, there are insects in your neighbor's garden, down the street, around the corner, across the concession. They're all in the same ecosystem. They're all fighting the same battle. And when you give them that food, they can proliferate and they can grow their next generation and help the crops being grown and help us and help the flowers being fertilized and bear their fruits. And that's what we want. That's what we ingest. That's our whole livelihood is in interaction with plant life. It gives us our ability to think, to have mental processes, cognition. Green plants are integral to our entire life cycle, to how we've evolved as humans, to our whole brain chemistry. Like, green plants can't disappear. And if we are only getting green plants, like Chris said, in a monoculture where there's only corn or soy being grown at certain times of the year, we're going to lose out on all of these plants that, you know, we need to ingest and we need to accumulate into our brains to actually think and to choose and to function, to be.
Right.
And that's really important.
Well, do you guys have a website, or is there any way, like, people wanted to follow you or to purchase honey in the fall, or is...
So we're legally allowed to sell from our doorstep, and this is it. So we haven't hit the markets and put our name out there, but if you're watching this video and you want some fine honey and you want to buy local, you can contact Sheldon and he'll get you in line with us.
Yep.
Or we can maybe put a link onto this YouTube feed and you can get a hold of us. And if you come to the place, just spare a few minutes to talk about some good things, because I'll talk bees all day.
All right. I really didn't understand much of what they were talking about. I don't know if you guys will either, but these guys are doing good stuff, producing pretty much some of the top-notch honey you've ever had. Appreciate you guys coming on here. And,
Thank you.
And talking and shit. That was good.
Thanks, brother.
All right.
Pleasure.
Until next time. We'll see ya.